All right, how's everyone doing? Good? Yes? All right, I'll make sure my clicker's working. I gotta turn it on. They reminded me to do that. All right, good. Okay, so welcome today. As you said, I'm Mandy Whaley. I am a Senior Director of Developer Experience at Cisco DevNet. And I was a daily user of the Eclipse IDE for many, many years. So first I just want to say thank you, because many, many days of one part of my career were spent every day in Eclipse. Now I help lead the developer experience team for Cisco. And what we do is we help developers who are building on top of Cisco platforms, from IoT to networking to data centers to collaboration across all of those technologies. So I'm very excited to be here at EclipseCon and see everything that this community is building and hear a lot about the innovation and work that's going on here. But that's not what I'm going to talk about right now. Today I'm going to talk about one of my childhood heroes, Marie Curie, and how some new learnings, some new research that I read about on her life and times really spoke to me, and there were some interesting parallels between that work in the early 1900s and some things that we see in our modern tech industry today. This all started with a present from my father. So it was a book. The book is called Making Marie Curie: Intellectual Property and Celebrity Culture in an Age of Information. Now, I don't know if we normally think about the early 1900s being an age of information, but the author makes a great job of pointing out that there was an explosion of information in that time. People had access to more journalism, more newspapers, more information than they ever had before. And it felt a little bit like the explosion of information we associate with the internet. And that's the same period of time where Marie Curie was doing her work and becoming this sort of science celebrity that we know today. So what I expected when I started this book was, oh, it'll be a nice read. I'll learn some new things about intellectual property law, which is kind of interesting, some new facts about my hero. But what I found were all these interesting parallels, and that's what I want to take you through today. But before we dive into the parallels, first, a quick refresher on Marie Curie's work. I think we all, have some idea about what Marie Curie did from maybe our chemistry and physics textbooks, but it may have been a long time ago since we looked at that. So we'll spend just a few minutes doing a quick refresher. This is a quote from Marie Curie. "Life is not easy for any of us, but what of that? We must have perseverance and above all confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something and that this thing must be attained." And I would say that this quote kind of summed up my impression of Marie Curie when I was in, middle school, high school. She was very gifted, she worked hard, she persevered, she won a Nobel Prize, and became this science role model. And that's all true. She was gifted, she persevered, she worked hard, she won 2 Nobel Prizes. But what I came to realize after reading this book was that the story is much more interesting when you start to layer in the scientific achievements with what was going on in the timeline of her personal life, and then also what was happening in the political and society times during all of that work. So what did she do? She coined the term radioactive. She was part of the most famous husband and wife science team probably ever. She discovered 2 new elements, polonium and radium. She was the first female professor at the Sorbonne. She was the first woman to ever win the Nobel Prize, and she is still the only woman to have won the Nobel Prize in 2 sciences. And it's interesting to note that just a couple weeks ago, we had the 3rd woman ever to win the Nobel Prize in physics. So the first was Marie Curie, the second was in the 1960s, and the 3rd just happened a couple weeks ago. So we can see that these achievements still stand out as pretty amazing and unusual. This was the periodic chart around the time of 1898. It looks a little bit different than the ones that we had in our textbooks, right? There's all these blank spaces. And those blank spaces are the places where they could theorize that elements had to exist. But they couldn't prove that they existed yet. So they were just question marks, and they knew that something probably should be there. And those 2 green spaces are where they theorized that the two elements that Marie Curie ended up discovering actually do exist, polonium and radium. And this was such a tangible achievement to me as a kid growing up and studying chemistry and physics, that this chart that I had hanging on my wall and was in every classroom that we went into, that Marie Curie's work actually cemented and found those elements that went into that chart. And I think that's one reason that, you know, her work always stayed with me as something interesting. Here's another quote from Marie that I found interesting. "I've frequently been questioned, especially by women, of how I could reconcile family life with a scientific career. Well, it has not been easy." This may be the understatement of a lifetime to some degree, right? And it becomes quite apparent when you do start to overlay her scientific achievements with what was going on in her life at the time. So she begins her studies. She comes from Poland to France because in Poland she wasn't allowed to pursue a master's degree. So she comes to France to study. She marries her husband, has her first daughter, and discovers polonium and radium. Then successfully isolates radium, and then in 1903, in the same year, wins the Nobel Prize and gets her PhD, and gets her doctorate in the same year. And then right after that has her second daughter. Then her husband is killed in a tragic accident. After that, she goes on, she wins the second Nobel Prize in chemistry, which is her work alone, and continues a very successful career. But if we look at those dates that are in blue, and especially the time from discovering radium and polonium to when Pierre dies in an accident, that's only 8 years. So it's this very compressed piece of time where she's doing a lot of amazing scientific work, also having a lot going on the personal side. And I think that adds an interesting piece to the story. Okay, so now I want to dive into the first parallel that I found that I want to share with you. And I call this parallel open sourcing radium. And it's kind of a publish versus patent decision, but has some interesting aspects to it. Okay, so one of the cool things about giving this talk is I always find out who in the audience that works in tech also started from maybe a chemistry or physics background. I started as a chemical engineer. That was my first career. So who maybe started from studying chemistry or physics or has some of that in your career background? Yes, it's amazing how many people there always are. So these next couple slides, these are for you. Because we have to dive into a little bit of how radium was discovered. The Curies were researching radiation, and they started researching all these different minerals that contained uranium that gave off radiation. And they discovered a way to make tools that could more precisely measure the amount of radiation than had ever been possible before. And because they could measure it so precisely, they had the observation that this one mineral they were studying called pitchblende gave off way more radioactivity than they could actually account for with just uranium. So they knew it must contain another highly radioactive element that was yet unknown, one of those blank spaces on the periodic chart. And then they did go on and they could discover these two new elements, polonium and radium. But radium doesn't occur freely by itself in nature. And Marie knew they had a lot of skeptics, and if they wanted to actually prove that they had discovered a new element and get it filled into the periodic chart, they must isolate a sample. This was really hard work. Marie spent years learning to develop a process to refine tons and tons of pitchblende to finally isolate 1/10 of a gram of radium. This was secret sauce. At this point in the world, no one else knew what that refining process looked like, how to actually do that separation. And so, when you have secret sauce, you have the dilemma of, are you going to publish or are you going to patent? How are you going to treat the work, right? Discovery of new elements, that's pure science. That's something that you would obviously publish. The process to refine something, this is invention. This is something that there was a lot of precedent to patent and make lots of money off of. People have made a lot of money off of chemical process prior to this point and certainly after. And so they were left with the decision of what would they do. There was an interesting catch though. In the early 1900s in France, married women could not own property. And this extended to intellectual property. The law grouped married women with children and the insane. They could not sign contracts, own any property, or manage their own affairs. And so at this point, when Marie was doing all of this work, had figured out this highly valuable process, there was no way for her to own intellectual property. So publish or patent. Who in here has been in a patent process? Who's gone through a patent process? Many, right? Put yourself in that process and imagine telling one of the lead researchers, the person who did primary work on what is going to be patented, that their name cannot be on the patent in any way because they're a married woman. That's an interesting spot to be in. And so what did they do? I think that looking at it through my technology and software eyes, the solution and the path that the Curies followed has some interesting resonance with what we do. They kind of did an open sourcing model. They published the knowledge and the details of how to do the process. They patented the tools and the measuring devices that they had created, but not the actual refining process. Then they provided consulting services, and they started the Radium Institute, which was like a thriving community around how to work with radium. And to me, this looked a lot like open sourcing your software, offering a hosted subscription, selling enterprise tools, and then starting a thriving community around it to further the research. And I thought this was a really interesting analogy to think about in the way that they treated it. By taking this route, they were able to have a way for Marie's name to still be on the research. She was on all of the publications. She got to remain a record of that work, right? And they found some ways to keep funding the research and drive the work forward. So it really gave her this concrete way to relentlessly build her track record and show her work, which was very important because at the time, there was a lot of questions. Was Marie more of a lab assistant? Was she more like a secretary for what was going on? Or was she pushing primary research? And being able to do the publications made that very obvious. Similar today, if you're participating in open source and you want a way to very concretely show what you're doing, the record of your commits do that for you. It's a way to publicly show your track record and your work. This is a picture of Marie's laboratory notebooks, which was another way that she was very, very diligent about showing her contributions to the work. And they're actually, right now, they're digitizing these notebooks, and they're going to have them online so that anyone can browse through them. And they actually have to do that because they are still so radioactive, it's unsafe to be around the notebooks. They have to be locked in lead boxes. But I think it's going to be very interesting to be able to actually see them. There was another aspect to the publishing that went on that was interesting. And this was how Marie's naming of herself and how her identity kind of shifted throughout the process. And it reminds me of some of the studies that we see about when people send emails and they sign it with a traditionally female name or a traditionally male name and get different responses to the emails. It's a little bit of the same phenomenon. So in the very first note that Marie and Pierre sent to the Academy of Sciences in France, saying that they had discovered these new elements, Marie is the only author, and she uses her full name with her Polish name. On the second note, she follows her husband, abbreviates the Polish name. On the final note, she's the second author between two men, and her Polish name is gone. It's just Madame P. Curie. Her name is actually gone. And the author points out that Pierre's identity stayed the same. Marie's was shifting around a little bit. And the reason for this was that as that research became more important, more strategic, more important to France as a country, it was more important to assign it to someone who had personhood under the law. And so you can see how that affected it. Okay, so now I want to jump to second parallel, and this is around a very active year in Marie Curie's career, 1910 to 1911. And there's some interesting things here that happen that I think have resonance with things that we see. So it's 1904. Marie and Pierre they have reached the level of celebrity. They're maybe one of our first really science celebrities that we have. Someone that filled that space that we think of like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, right? They were in Vanity Fair. as this modern couple, with the glowing test tube showing this new phenomenon of radioactivity, that everyone's imagination had really caught fire with what can we do with radioactive substances. This was like a very hot and interesting topic at the time. So really at the peak of that celebrity, and then tragedy strikes. Pierre is hit by a carriage, in the street, hit by a carriage, killed instantly. So you can imagine this causes some disruption, and not just for the Curies, this was actually a big disruption for France. France considered the research on radium to be a very strategic thing for the country, giving them a competitive edge. So they actually take this radical step and nominate Marie to be the first female professor at the Sorbonne, to take over Pierre's space and to continue to run that research lab. And then the other interesting thing is that now, as a widow, Marie can own property. She is considered a person. She can sign contracts. She can do all of those things, which seems like a positive move, right? But it actually caused some interesting effects. She comes out of the shadows, and the work is continuing. And the people who found it convenient to assume that maybe she was a lab assistant or not really driving the primary research, they can't pretend that anymore. They can't assume that. She's able to sign contracts, she can own property, she can be a professor. She becomes very hard to ignore, and at the same time becomes very irritating to some of the establishment because of that. What was going on in society at this time is there was a rising tide of traditionalism and nationalism, and both Marie and Pierre were seen as representing modern ideals. She was Polish, she was the mother of a young daughter, first woman ever to defend her thesis or be a professor at the Sorbonne. Definitely had that representation of modern in everyone's mind share. And then what happens is that the Academy of Sciences, which was the leading scientific body in France, has a seat open. Pierre had been on the Academy before. In 1910, a seat opens, and Marie is a candidate. And everyone, to some extent, thinks she's a natural choice, right? This is this very strategic work. France is very interested in it continuing. But the difference is she's going to be the first female candidate ever to even have been nominated to be on the Academy. So she knows that this is going to turn into something that's a lot more than the usual debate about who gets elected to be on the Academy of Sciences. And she puts out this quote that says, these discussions aren't really discussed in the press or in the public light, and I don't want that to change on my account. Let's keep it about the scientific work. This was a good try, but this did not work. This is a picture of Marie hiding behind her purse from the paparazzi because they were waiting outside of her laboratory. The press went crazy with this story. They made it into a debate between two worlds, two people, not about two scientists and their work at all. It just built and built and built, and this became the debate that was at every dinner party, at every cocktail hour. It was, what are your thoughts on the candidacy for the Academy of Sciences? Should we allow female candidates? What's going to happen? And they built this up to be this choice between two worlds of very traditional or modern. And then they got to the day for the vote, and they said no. They elected Edward Branly, this was his third time to be up for the Academy. They just felt that it was moving too fast, too much change, too quick to have a female elected to the Academy. And there's a lot of question, will Marie try again? Many people would be a candidate multiple times. She decided not to try again. How long do you think it was until the first female member was elected? Anyone, say a number. 18? It was 68 years. Yeah, 1979. We almost had like 80s music and stuff before. I mean, come on. This number blew me away. I kept checking it over and over because I just really could not believe it the first time I read it. But it had that much effect because she was such a strong candidate and still didn't make it, that I think it had a very lasting effect. And then things got even a little bit stranger for the last half of that year. There were some love letters that were stolen. There was an alleged affair. There were 5 duels fought over Marie Curie's honor. 4 with pistols, 1 with épée. And during all of this, she won her 2nd Nobel Prize. And there was a lot of controversy of should she go and accept the 2nd Nobel Prize while all of this was going on. This was the one she won for chemistry. This one was her research only. And they kind of asked her not to come and accept it, maybe to delay a little bit until it calmed down. But she went ahead. She said, I don't see any connection between my scientific, my private life. I'm coming. I'm going to accept my award. And she went and she weathered the storm, and it kind of died down after that. And she continued on her career and kept working. But this year of 1911 was really this peak, a peak of scientific achievement and a peak of all of this celebrity culture going on around her and controversy, which is interesting to look at. Then the last parallel I want to dive into is a little bit more heartwarming, and so it's a good one to end on. And this is what I call Marie Curie's Kickstarter campaign, and this is about crowdsourcing radium. So it's 1921. Now the Radium Institute has been in effect for a while. There's tons of research going on. The US is the biggest producer of radium at this point. How many grams of radium do you think exist in the US in 1921? 2, 20, 200, 2,000, 50. 50 grams exist in the US. How many grams do you think the Radium Institute had for research? Close, less than 1. They had a little bit of 1. How many did Marie Curie's own lab have for research? 0, none. And so the reason for this was that in 1921, a gram of radium cost $100,000. $100,000 in 1921 dollars. It was the most valuable material on Earth at this time. And about this same time, Marie Curie meets a New York socialite named Missy Brown. And Missy Brown is a huge admirer of Marie Curie. And she gets to talking to her, and she says, well, how many grams of radium does your laboratory have for research? You must have all those patents on how to make it, right? And she says, no, we don't have any. I don't have any. I make sure that the Radium Institute has, whatever I get. And so Missy Brown could not believe this, and she wanted to do something about it. So she took action and started a subscription fund to buy Marie Curie a gram of radium. This would be a gram of radium for Marie Curie's laboratory for her own personal research. It was a personal gift from the women of the US at that time to Marie Curie. And originally she thought, okay, I'll just go and get she was a very wealthy person, several wealthy friends to all give $10,000. We're done. That was easy. But then she decides to do something bigger with this. She decided to make it actually into a subscription fund where there was a book in every bank in America, and anyone could walk in and pledge whatever amount they wanted, 50 cents, $1, $1,000. And it took off, and people were literally having bake sales to raise money to give to this Marie Curie's fund. Girls' clubs were raising money, and it was really because of this power of you could have someone walk in and donate $1 right in the same place that someone was donating more money. And it was a phenomenal success. They raised enough money, and Marie Curie came to the United States to accept the gram of radium. They actually scraped together 3 times the amount that Einstein won for the Nobel Prize that same year. And this would be equivalent to today saying, hey, there's a scientist out there somewhere, and we really believe in her work. We're not exactly sure what she's going to do, but we believe in her work, and we've raised $1.3 million that we're going to give her to continue her work. That was how much belief and sort of power went into this subscription fund. So it was pretty amazing from that perspective. Okay, but why talk about all this history? That's a lot of history, right? Maybe, especially for a tech conference, maybe too much history for some people. But I think it's useful. I found as I've been thinking about this more, that if you can take something like this and take a current event and maybe switch out the names, and if you're thinking about it's a case where someone is not being allowed to do something new, and switch out the names to be Marie Curie and the Academy of Sciences, and does it still make sense? And it can be a way to have conversation with people who maybe you're trying to change their mind as well, and it can be very useful in that case. And the other reason is really the power of heroes. So Wonder Woman, pretty amazing hero. Who liked the last movie that was out a couple summers ago? Yeah, pretty amazing. Wonder Woman was definitely one of my childhood heroes, and I have this name tag to prove it. So do you remember the old label makers where you turned the thing and then squeezed it and they were just mechanical? Yeah, that was one of my favorite toys as a kid. And I made this name tag for myself. And I have this name tag in this frame because my mom sent it to me. This was right after I'd had my first child, and I was heading back to work. And I was having a really hard time reconciling how do I be a new mom, and how do I have my career, and how do I restart my career, and how do I be all these things at once? And my amazing mom found this name tag somewhere. I have no idea how she found it, mailed it to me, and said, look at all these things you thought you could be at the same time when you were 5. You thought you could be Wonder Woman, Mandy White, and Queen of Hawaii all at the same time. She's like, I think you've got this. I think you can figure it out. So, you know, Wonder Woman obviously influenced in my life. But back to Marie Curie. You know that scene in Wonder Woman where she's racing across no man's land and she's like deflecting all the bullets with her arm cuffs? That kind of heroism is what I see in that year of 1910 to 1911 for Marie Curie, where she's keeping her scientific work going, she's heading down the path of research she's been pushing, but at the same time deflecting all of this turmoil and controversy, and she makes it through, she makes it to the other side of that. And I think that's really important. I also think about it from, what did I end up doing as my career? What did I actually end up growing up to be? And I think about when I was a kid and the things I was interested in. And, you know, one of those things was math. I loved math. I read lots of math books. I read about lots of mathematicians. I had my ideas of what a mathematician was like. At one point, I wanted to be an archaeologist like Indiana Jones, or maybe a paleontologist and discover dinosaurs in Montana like Jack Horner. And then I knew about computers. I read The Cuckoo's Egg when I was really little. Who's read The Cuckoo's Egg? If you haven't, read this book. It's like one of the original hacker books, and it's amazing. And then my grandmother was in the Navy, so she was constantly telling me about Grace Hopper, so I definitely knew about that. And I knew about Marie Curie. And then when I think about when I went to school, to college, to university, and was picking what I was going to study, I would have been the first 18-year-old to say, I don't need female role models, I can do whatever I want, and it doesn't have any influence. But what I picked was chemistry and computers. And I have to wonder a little bit now if it did have an influence and I didn't realize it. And what I said at the time was, I think those are more realistic choices for me. And it's hard to know what your 18-year-old self was thinking. But I do think now, looking back, that that probably was a factor. So it is very important. So thanks for staying with me through all of those parallels. I hope you found some of them interesting. If you want to read the book for yourself, it doesn't have the parallels to open source and things in it. Those were my observations. But there is a load of great research about Marie Curie in this book, and I definitely recommend it. Please check it out. And you can find me on Twitter at Mandy Whaley. I love to get questions and hear about your experiences. And you can also find me through the DevNet community. So thank you very much. Have a great conference.